Hey guys, so myself and Flamefang were recently invited by Creative Assembly to a special event showcasing another race from the upcoming Total War Warhammer game. Now, as you guys know, I've been eagerly awaiting this title. I'm a fan of both Total War and also the Warhammer universe, and whilst I'm strictly a 40k guy, the concept of having some element of Warhammer anything in Total War is pretty exciting. So far, the general opinion has been fairly positive towards the game, as many of the mechanics build and learn from previous iterations, yet at the same time bring a lot of new elements to the table in the form of magic, monstrous creatures, races from Fantasy Warhammer, and actually a lot of other mechanics as well. We've seen quite a lot of the game so far when it comes to those races, but this event was themed specifically around the vampires and undead. We got to play the campaign for the first time, whereas all people had really played previously are the actual battles. Now, I will say straight away that I've played Total War campaigns before, but I tend to be more focused on the actual battles and how they play out, whereas Flame has played the campaign stuff extensively. He knows a lot about that. The campaign section that we were able to play through felt pretty easy to understand and led you comfortably into the game, which is obviously important because I would imagine that Total Warhammer is actually going to bring in a lot of new players to the game, so ensuring that they're led into the campaign properly with good explanations and tutorials is pretty important. Attila, I'd found that the tutorial was actually brutally challenging, so much so that it was like quite a struggle in some situations, and this iteration felt it kind of brought you into the game in not an easy way, but it sort of made a bit more sense of things, and I kind of felt that I could engage better with the game. Also, I feel like this game has got not an arcadey feel, that's not the right word to use, but somehow it felt more user-friendly. I just felt that I engaged better with what was happening, and I don't know whether that's just because I got a bit of background with Warhammer and therefore I felt more connected with some of the things that were going on there. I don't know. But me and Flame now, let's talk about the campaign and our experience on the day. Also guys, please note that some of the background footage today obviously does not relate to the vampires or the undead, but because this is quite a long video of discussion, I needed to fill something in the background there. So we're still seeing the battle here versus Orcs and Empire, but this is actually pretty good because it gives you this kind of a bit of a look back and a remembrance about what we've seen already. So Flame, what was your kind of, I guess, overall impression of this? Any kind of significant differences that you might note between this and general Total War?
I really enjoyed it. Significant differences. I mean, they're sort of obvious and everywhere. For one, we're just playing undead, which is something that you're never going to see in any other Total War game because they're all historical. But also, just the way the vampire counts play, both in combat and on the map, is really very, very different. It speaks to sort of asymmetric nature of playing the game, where all the factions are quite different, and you have to understand how the factions are different in order to play them properly.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big things with Total Warhammer, as it were, is that, you know, I think for a while when I was speaking to people about Total War after Attila as well, and, some people have said, well, they really need to change it up, they really need to push it forward in a different direction. I think that's what this game does. I think there are still some unknown quantities in terms of, this is the difficulty, is like you say, knowing those different faction types, and the balance there, I think, is going to be the real critical issue. Can you have balanced combat? Now, I would like to think that they have tested the hell out of this game, and I think so far from what we have seen, whether it's been orcs fighting dwarves or the gameplay that we've seen of Empire and all these things, I think they do seem relatively balanced, especially when you have like the monstrous creatures in there and the characters that we have in there now and the things that they can do. But all of the gameplay that I've played so far, it has actually worked, and I haven't felt at one time like, man, that guy's absolutely destroying everything that it can see. There always seems to be a bit of a counter, and I think that's always the way with Total War games, is that specific unit types are used against specific things. It's quite rock, paper, scissors, isn't it, in sort of how people approach there. And then, of course, like we're saying, individual factions are going to have their own unique traits, and I guess the biggest one we're saying about with Undead and the Vampiric is that they don't have any ranged units, which is really going to change it up, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, range units have always been a really big part of Total War. They're sort of a big part of the opening phase of combat, usually. And if you don't have any, typically, you're kind of done, unless you somehow manage to pull something good off. But obviously, they have to be balanced to not take that into account, and that also really affects the way you play the game. One minor thing I noticed is when you have vampire counts versus vampire counts, you have this weird sort of standoff sometimes at the start of battle where nobody's really firing anything at each other, but you're just waiting to outmaneuver the other person because you don't have any range units.
Yeah, I remember seeing that actually, because we were sat next to each other when we were playing, and yeah, basically you were playing both sort of vampiric. Was it vampiric or vampiric and undead, or both together?
But
we were playing against each other.
Counts.
Yeah. And so you kind of like had your armies lined up, and they were just kind of like standing. And they were just like, right, I don't want to make the first move. Did you bait them in the end, I think? Because I said, like, you need to just bait them out, and that's what happened. So if you kind of sent one guy out, and they're like, oh, he's coming, and then once you've initiated it, it just plays on like a normal battle. But it was kind of funny. They're just standing there, and normally you can move forward a little bit and fire some ranged, but that didn't happen, so they're just kind of standing looking at each other. From the gameplay you've seen so far, what do you think about that balance issue, in the fact that there are so many kind of unique aspects to the different races and groups here so far? I mean, because we've seen with the monstrous creatures, you got to play with those and the lord characters within that. How did that feel to you overall?
It felt pretty good to me. Though I should probably note that I only fought one faction other than the vampire counts in my campaign, which was the Empire.
Yeah.
That battle felt quite balanced to me. But again, I mean, there's many other factions in the game. As for the great creatures, those seem to be pretty well implemented. They're not really overpoweringly strong to the point where you just throw it in and it's like the battle's over. They're more something that you have to sort of grind down, slowly destroy, but really sort of take into account when you're fighting them or using them in your army, because they can really sway the battle in big ways.
Yeah, and I think like anything in Total War, you know, if you put a monstrous creature against a group of archers, it's going to destroy them. But if you throw them into the mix versus a load of infantry and spear guys and so on, they're going to have a more grinding time there. And I would say, yeah, it's very much like, I think if you have a monstrous creature versus one other unit, that's going to be maybe not an even match, but they'll sort of fight it out for some time. If he's facing maybe multiple groups, then that's going to be a real problem. So yeah, he's definitely, you know, whether it's the Arachnarok or a giant or whatever, they're definitely not kind of things that you can just throw at units and they just destroy them, which is obviously really good. I mean, they look like they kind of should do that, but it's cool they don't. One other thing I wanted to bring up was the Fellbats, because they looked awesome. I really enjoyed those guys. So they're sort of flying above and then they come down. I mean, flying units is another new thing, because obviously we never had that. There was never any cause to have that in historical Total War games. What do you think about the kind of flying units and stuff?
Yeah, they're actually quite interesting. They affected the way I played in some sort of major ways, because the vampire counts have some relatively weak units, which are like zombies, and they're quite vulnerable to these flying units. And they have some sort of more heavily armored units that I would put up at the front, and I would use the zombies. Sometimes like come around it, I keep some in reserve. But they actually just flew their guys right over my armored guys. Yeah. I went straight back to my zombies and started tearing them apart, which was something I just didn't really account for, because I'm not used to flying units. Yeah. And I later used that strategy myself, and it's quite useful. Yeah,
the flying units can definitely, and you have stuff with the flying units as well, like the dwarf guys, and they actually do drop bombs, which is like quite epic. And you can do this thing where you have like 3 of them together fly over in a formation and just drop bombs onto people, and you have to get the timing right, but it's quite devastating. So there's a lot of new mechanics in this. I definitely don't think it's like just another Total War game. It's really changes it up, and I think as well, if you're interested in kind of fantasy or Warhammer in general, I mean, I'm like a really Warhammer 40k person, but even, you know, just this Warhammer style, it does pull you in, and it does give me a lot more interest to the game. But I think that the diversity of the fantasy elements in this, whether it's Warhammer or Warhammer 40k, Games Workshop are excellent at their sort of diversity of content and lore, you know, and I think that really pulls you into the world and really makes you feel sort of engrossed in it. You know, you sort of really want to get involved and learn more about it. What do you think about the sort of magic and stuff? Did you get a chance to use any of that kind of thing in there? The death magic?
I used some of the magic. It seemed pretty powerful. I didn't get that far with it because, you know, we only had so much time to play.
Yeah.
And it was mostly vampire counts versus other vampire counts, so the spells we were using were the same.
Yeah. It's one of those time things again, because obviously it's not an ability you can just use constantly. So it's one of those things to choose at the right moment. And I think that's going to be the key with you know, some of the gameplay in this, is that it's really down to timing. I mean, that could be arguably said about any Total War or strategy game in general, that, you know, your timing about things is critical always. But it's just like you have some more abilities at your, you know, beck and call. You can kind of utilize more elements and more diverse ways of engaging your enemy, and I think that's going to really change it up and be interesting, and maybe allow for a bit more kind of individual play styles, rather than just kind of, I've got my spear guys here and I've got my range guys here and I know how to deal with this situation. Don't you think? A bit more like that. It's a bit more sort of faction specific.
Yeah, definitely. It also lets you sort of customize your heroes in different ways. Like you can make a sort of more supporting hero. You could have a more offensive hero. You could have a hero that's just set up to support on the campaign map. And while there's been some of that already in Total War with character customization, general customization, in this game it seems like it has a much more direct and visible impact on things.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's just talk very briefly on the last thing, and that is the Rising the Dead mechanic, which is really quite powerful. Do you want to give an overview of that, Flame? Just explain sort of what it is and how it works for the undead and the vampires?
Yeah, sure. So basically, if you have an army in any piece of territory, your character can perform a move on the campaign map where he basically raises the dead, which adds units to your army. Now, those units are fairly random. They're determined more by the number of and type of battles that have taken place in that area prior, and you can't repeatedly do it. You can only raise dead again, like, say, several turns after you did first, and even there's a resource cost. But it's quite cheap, and
Yeah.
the fact that you can raise units literally anywhere is incredibly powerful for anybody who either wants to carry out sort of long-distance attacks against the enemy, or just have a really powerful sort of steamroller campaign whereby you can just constantly replenish your units.
Yeah, it makes it really hard, and I think this is going to be the interesting thing with this faction is until we get it into the campaign, really can't see how it's going to play, but I likened it very much similar to kind of, say, Russians in Company of Heroes or something like this, you know. Again, that's a fairly loose comparison, but it's that idea of being able to gather a lot of units very quickly, but maybe they aren't the strongest units, but you almost have that weight of numbers, you know, and it felt like, from what I was playing and what I was seeing there, that's how it's going to carry, that these guys have just got that weight of power, and like you say, they can get the cheap resources, and it means that you're more able to kind of just continually fight, and push, and so any kind of encounter that you're coming across, that enemy, they're going to need to be strong with their defense to be really holding you back, holding the tide. I guess also it's slightly in fiction, you know, this idea of the undead and the dark sort of wave of corruption spreading across everywhere, that idea that it is kind of unstoppable and spreading into the region, and you know, they're really struggling to hold it back, right? So it kind of has that in fiction role alongside the literal mechanic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really going to change the way the game plays on the campaign map.
So this was another look at Total Warhammer. Me and Flame had a good day, and we got to see some of this new gameplay. Tell us what you thought of the breakdown. Tell us what you thought of the new factions. Do you think that this is going to change up the game in terms of balancing between those units and how the game plays out? If you have never played Total War before, if you're maybe into Warhammer, or maybe you just like the look of this game, is it something that you would want to try out off the basis of this? Tell me down in the comments below. There is one last little bit to this video today, guys. It was one of the coolest things I have ever seen at an event that I've been to. I think you'll enjoy as well. Thanks for watching, and enjoy.